First, the US must either withdraw from the alliance or refuse to aid its NATO partners, even if a Russian invasion triggers Article 5 of the NATO Charter. Second, Putin must have the desire to claim more of Europe if he's successful in Ukraine. The short answer is yes. It's a possibility that Russia could wage war on Europe and the US wouldn't intervene. Starting with the weakening of NATO, the concept of Trump removing the US from the coalition is far from new. Back in 2018, during Trump's first stint as US president, Trump reportedly told senior administration officials several times that he desired the removal of the US from NATO. Those statements included claims that Trump didn't see the point of maintaining such a large military alliance, especially as he believed that the existence of NATO was a drain on America's resources. A year before, Trump had also started telling NATO members that it was time to pay their way. During a NATO meeting in Brussels, he said that massive amounts of money were owed to the US by the other members of the coalition, while pointing out that many of NATO's members fall well short of the defense spending of 2% of gross domestic product, or GDP, that NATO recommends. And he was right. In 2017, only 4 nations were meeting what Trump believed was an obligation more than a recommendation. Those countries were Estonia, which spent 2.01% of its GDP on defense, Greece, with 2.38%, the UK, which spent 2.06%, and of course, the United States as the highest spender at 3.31%. At the time, NATO had 29 members, meaning less than 14% of its members were hitting the 2% recommendation. Trump's argument at the time seemed fairly simple: pay up or the US is gone. NATO has changed its tack. Fast forward to 2024 and NATO has expanded to include 32 members. Of those members, 23 are hitting the target of at least 2% of GDP spending on their defense. It's not a perfect record. Around 2/3 of NATO allies are hitting the target, but that's a lot better than the 14% or so of 2017, which would suggest that Trump was getting his way. America's NATO allies were starting to spend at similar levels, at least in terms of GDP, as the United States. The problem for Europe, and the reason why Zelensky is warning that Russia is preparing to wage war on NATO, is that Trump may not have changed his views on the US leaving the alliance. On February 14th, the UK Defense Journal reported on comments made by former US National Security Advisor John Bolton, who served under Trump during his first presidential term. He suggests that Trump is now moving the goalpost to keep the door open for the removal of the US from NATO. First, he said back in his initial term, well, all these Europeans are not spending 2% of GDP on defense. Now he's saying you need to spend 5% of GDP on defense, Bolton said. He's referring to comments made by Trump in early January 2025, when America's president claimed that NATO should have a 5% target. They can all afford it, said Trump, but they should be at 5%, not 2%. Note that Trump didn't say "we" here. He talked about NATO as a separate entity from the United States, acting as though all the other members should hit a new 5% target from which America is immune. The US also doesn't spend 5% of its GDP on defense either, with the country hitting 3.4% of GDP expenditure in 2024. That puts it about level with Estonia, also at 3.4% and quite a way behind Poland, which spent 4.1% of its GDP on its military. Bolton actually agrees with Trump's comments to an extent. He says that he believes the US itself isn't spending enough in a challenging world. However, he also points out that Trump's call for 5% may be an interesting goal. I suspect there's almost no country in Europe, maybe the Baltics and Poland and a few others, that will go to 5%. So in a year when it doesn't happen, Trump will be able to say, NATO is just as worthless as I always said it was, I'm getting out. In other words, Trump has moved the spending goalpost now so that more European NATO members are hitting the 2% target, and he's doing it because he sees it as a route for pulling the US out of the alliance. There's only one potential saving grace for NATO's European members. The US Congress stands as the guardrail that keeps America in the coalition. Any decision to leave has to first pass through Congress before it can be made a reality. Former US President Joe Biden signed that requirement into law as part of the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act, which may have been Biden's subtle way of preparing for the possibility of a Trump presidency. The problem is that the law isn't airtight. This is not open and shut, claims Brookings Institution scholar and senior editor of Lawfare Scott Anderson. This is about Congress telling you that you can't do this, and if you ignore Congress, you're going to have to fight us in the courts over it, he says. Therein lies the problem. For the issue to be litigated, Anderson claims, there needs to be someone with standing to sue. That someone could be Congress, only it's not clear if the Republicans in Congress would be willing to launch a lawsuit against their own elected president.